All right, thank you all for coming. This is great. You know, we do brown bag once a month on the first Friday of the month. And every time we have a different group of people that shows up, so that's very good. It's what we're trying to encourage. I'm Emily Scott. I'm a professor of geography and environmental studies here on campus and director of the Global Intercultural Research Center. And we are a faculty-oriented center that is encouraging exchanges amongst ourselves and students and staff on issues related to global intercultural research. And Steve Raka is one of our board members and one of the best people on campus on this subject matter. And so he has a tremendous biography. A very successful person and very modest too. So I should take this time to brag about him because he'll never ever do it himself. But he is the executive director of the Center for Human Security here at UCCS in our School of Public Affairs. He also serves as the co-director of the University and Agency Partnership Initiative for the Naval Postgraduate School Center for Homeland Defense and Security. That's a long title.
Yes, painfully long, actually.
And as the Humanitarian Assistant Program Advisor with the Pacific Disaster Center, which is the piece of his work that I particularly find especially fascinating. He is deeply engaged in much of the security world in our country and has done tremendous work overseas as well. And so we have him here, including working for U.S. embassies in Oslo, special assistant and special speechwriter for the Secretary of the Navy and director of the Central Intelligence Agency. So his credentials are just tremendous, and we're blessed to have him here because he's always somewhere else.
That's right. So except on Wednesdays.
So he is going to help us out actually understanding and exploring the concept of human security in intercultural research. So thank you, Steve.
Great. Thanks, Emily. Welcome. So thanks for making time. This is hopefully it wasn't too painful for you guys coming off campus to come in, but glad to have you here. And so it sounds like a mix of talent in the room as well. So psychology, and geography, a wide variety of backgrounds. So good group too for discussion. That's really what I hope to do was figure out from you guys what the heck human security is all about. I can tell you what I think it is, but human security strikes me as one of those where it's in not so much the eye of the beholder, but rather how we think about our own security is very personal. And I'll flesh some of these ideas out a little bit, but first so why are we here? Why are you here? What's human security mean to you? Anybody want to take a risk and share some thoughts?
What about basic welfare? I mean, part of our security comes from food, shelter, clothing.
Good.
So
Medical supplies.
Medical supplies, right? Yeah. Pam, any thoughts? Anything cross your mind? And it strikes you like human security. What is this topic? Because I get this all the time, right? I come from a hard security world. So what's this human security thing?
Yeah, to me it's any threat to any population, whatever that might be, whether it's a natural disaster or other humans or scarcity for those basic needs, whatever. I mean, the unstable political situation, anything that could contribute to not having that security.
Good. Yeah. Thanks. Jacob, any thoughts?
It's just maintaining the basic resources of human life.
Okay. Good. Reasonable. Yeah. Matt, anything else now? Yes.
Now that I've heard everybody else, yeah, I actually anything that can promote and support sort of basic needs, that kind of stuff. So.
When I first, so let me talk to you a little about the derivation for me, where this concept came from. It's not terms human security not new. The Danes have used it primarily with a healthcare focus. There's a human security initiative out of Harvard that is healthcare focused. But in my world of intelligence and national security, military, those guards, gates, and guns piece, the issue really struck me as we weren't solving problems. We were, it's kind of almost a whack-a-mole idea, right? So you attack the problem with vigor. You go after ISIS in in Syria or in Iraq and you attack that, that's something we can do. It's a discrete problem, you go right to it. But does that really resolve the long-term sustaining issues around security? And so the notion from my hard security world is, what is it that makes us secure, actually be secure, and then also what makes us feel secure? And so we started to look at how do we create a question set, and how do we develop the research, and that's where the connection with GLINT really comes in. Is how do we develop research that is both local, but national, as well as international, and along that line, intercultural across the realm, whether it's intercultural here in Colorado Springs or intercultural in a global context. The notion of what makes us actually be secure and what makes us feel secure. And there, I think there's a fair chance to say that having sat across the dinner table from a psychologist to be, a therapist to be, helped shape some of that thinking, that if we're talking about security, we actually had to understand the perception as well as the reality of how we feel about it. So I'm going to show some images. It's a multi-page PowerPoint, but except for one slide, and then my last slide, there are no words on it. So we're just going to play around with some imagery here. So when we think about security, what is it we're trying to secure? That's kind of my first thought. What are we after here? Well, there's a sense of, well, I have a family, I have 3 daughters. I want to make sure that I'm safe and secure. I want to make sure my 3 daughters, my wife, my livelihood, all those pieces, my chance to be with friends, to recreate, my way of life is secure. Right? So that's kind of the notion of what are we thinking about when we think of human security? I'm a human, and I want the things that are dear to me to be secure. I don't think it's any more complex than that. But that is the root issue here when we talk more broadly about it. And how do we do that? How do we think about security in terms of what makes us secure? Do we put a fence around? Is that how it is? Anybody a frequent traveler around here? I spend an awful lot of time with these guys in blue in the lower left. TSA, so that's not a great image, but that's a TSA airport control point. Is that what makes us secure? So we turn our hands over to the government? Is it these guys that make us secure? Army? Certainly there's a role for each of these pieces, right? That's kind of the thought. Do we bring it closer to home? Is it the Colorado Springs Police Department? Is it the FBI? How do we think about those things that make us secure? Or, a very practical note, is it me standing in my front porch with a shotgun making sure that nobody comes in? Anybody old enough? Well, some of us are old enough to remember this TV series. Somebody, Jacob, does this look familiar? Does this woman look familiar to you at all?
It doesn't.
That's a good sign. That's a good sign. It should be wiped from memory completely. It was
Is that Beverly Hillbillies?
Beverly Hillbillies, yeah. The Granny and Beverly Hillbillies, which for some of us that were TV junkies when our kids got to watch it. So how we think about security, right? So first, what is it we want to be secure of? What's the thing we're trying to protect? And then my notion, this construct is, okay, so now that I want to protect my family, how do I go about doing that? How much do I turn over to Colorado Springs PD? How much control do I give to the Transportation Security Administration, how much do I give to the military? How much do I say, you guys have it, you guys take this, I'm responsible for this chunk or not? I just give my that span of control over. So 2 pieces. The third piece then is, what are we worried about? Right? And that's a big topic in the news right now. Has been for a while, arguably well before 9/11, of course, for those of us that span that time. But since 9/11, we've certainly thought about security and personal security in a different way. That event touched us in a very profound way, because all of a sudden, anybody could be at risk at any time. And that's the notion behind terrorism. So from some of us who grew up, this is what we were worried about, right? We were worried about the Cold War and the threat of nuclear annihilation. That threat hasn't gone away. Just looking at the press reporting regarding North Korea, right? It's something that we will always be in our frame. As long as nuclear weapons exist, there will be a threat of a nation using a nuclear weapon, North Korea potentially, or a terrorist organization getting hold of a nuclear weapon and using it. So that's something that's part of our psyche and how we think about it. But what other threats? The list is long, right? We appreciate that, I think. From 9/11 to the Boston Marathon bombings, Just some of the other examples we look at ISIS, the Islamic State. We look at the war in Syria, attacks in Orlando, in Paris, Pakistan. So activities around the world that are threatening human security on a very violent, human-on-human conflict basis. Again, that's not meant to represent all. But what about these issues? Some of you remember the iconic image from China in 1989, the protesters standing in front of the row of tanks. Right? What about the transitions in Turkey right now? Protests there. Million Woman March, near and dear to our house. The issues and discussions over whether it's gun rights, gun control, women's rights. These are issues that we see every day. So how do we view these as threats? Do they impinge on our human security? And arguably, yeah. So as we think about human security, the notion is to open the aperture, right? Move well beyond guards, gates, and guns. And you're in professions where you do this already. We are as well. We have the luxury here, really the responsibility at the university to think about security well beyond the Colorado Springs Police Department, a SWAT team, the military force, the intelligence agencies, etc. It goes well beyond that. So how do we think about security? And you mentioned earlier, so well-being, right? It's how we think holistically about our financial well-being, our mental health, our physical health. So when we look at threats as well here, right? There's an awful lot of rhetoric going on that politics and governance issues are driving the concerns we face. I feel less secure with the election or the inauguration, or right. We have friends, colleagues, family members that certainly feel threatened by the current political dynamic in the country and this administration. Okay, so how do we think about that? How do we put that in context? Is it really, is this the concern point? Is this the threat? Because again, the idea is you identify what you're concerned about, and we've got to do something about it. So what is it that we do about it? Right? If you're the honest concern is President Trump or Republican leadership in Congress, great. If that's what that's keeping me awake at night, then how do I shape my thinking and build my security, my human security, my family, right? All those things we held dear. So let's take it down to again another level. Issues that we see in the news every day that somehow touch us. I'm fortunate enough to teach a brand new iteration of a course called Introduction to Human Security, where I get to play with a group of very thoughtful students. We have 40 in the class, a mix between freshmen, sophomore, juniors, and seniors, where we're exploring ideas on what human security means to them and how we start to think about it. So the thinking process behind it. Right? So there are issues from Sandy Hook to Ferguson to here closer to home with the Planned Parenthood shooting. How do we think about those in the threat matrix? Are these one-off events? What should I do for me and my family? Again, that's what it comes down to. Again, it's so easy to think national strategy, and this is what I'm going to do against the Islamic State, or this is what I'm going to do about terrorism writ large, but what am I going to do when I'm at King Soopers and across the parking lot there's a shooting, right? And they've locked me in. There's a question here.
Question, kind of comment. Well, one, going back to the administration, and I don't, I guess the fear is that I don't know. Some people have a lack of diplomacy, so then you're gonna piss people off, rather than being super political versus being diplomatic. I guess that's for the previous slide.
Okay.
That's my fear, is that someone's gonna take off another country or whatever policies that they put in. This here is, you say, oh, these are one-offs, and then I had mentioned to someone, it seems like they occur more and more frequently, and then the argument was, no, it's because there's social media and there's media coverage, and anyone can just take, But it didn't seem like that 20 years ago. It seems like there's more and more, and it becomes more frequent. Is that perception true?
Well, first, depends on which, I would suggest here.
Shootings, local
here and
shootings
here.
type of thing.
So the Sandy Hook and Planned Parenthood shootings.
Yeah, those kind of.
I'm going to defer to two experts in the room on mental health. I would suggest we have a kind of an interesting time right now where there are greater concerns and issues around mental health than this country has ever faced, the world has ever faced, and the access to weapons, not just guns, but really anything, it is still open and broadly available. So the notion that we have a rise in challenges in mental health, yet we have a culture still in the United States that is a legacy culture of Second Amendment rights and kind of the West and being able to defend ourselves in kind of a Western model. I mean, that's what I grew up in, right? I'm comfortable with that. But that predates many of the mental health issues I think that we see today. So may I ask, does that seem like a reasonable assessment? This is how I pitch it when I talk to larger audiences. That we have this hasn't changed, and mental health issues have expanded exponentially.
Yeah, I think that we've experienced that with our military population, particularly because we're a heavy concentration in Colorado Springs. I grew up here and there's always been military all around, So I think we see that, and then multiple deployments. So, we've had quite a few school suicides in the last few years just in town. And so younger kids too, I think families are more and more fragmented. And so you see the mental health issues start earlier on. Cedar Springs, I went to an open house a couple weeks ago. They just opened an inpatient for youth that goes down to 3 years old. They hospitalize kids as young as 3 now. And they've had even an 18-month-old referred to them. It's just amazing to me. Having been in this field since the late 70s, early 80s, I'm just amazed that it just continues to escalate or evolve. But it's a bigger city too. When I grew up here, it was 150,000. It's what, 600 or something now. So, everything's exponential that way. But
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah, I think there's some structures in our society that don't really allow mental health to be expressed the way it should be. And I've done a little bit on like gender stuff and post-trauma growth, and there's definitely some things going on there. But yeah, all the therapists that I've talked to when we discuss these shootings, it's stigma against getting help, and it's just poor systems in place to support people who are hurting, like these gentlemen.
See, there was no mental health services in 70s, 60s, 50s when I was in school. There was no such thing. Even in college, there was no college counseling center. There was no such thing. I didn't feel like we had a great need for it, but there wasn't any. And so, my premonition on this thing is that I think people that don't have access so that we don't make it okay. If we make it okay to seek help, then it doesn't drive it underground. These people that you see up here, they've been driven underground, isolated from social culture, from social norms, and that's where you get these aberrations and these people act out because they've been bullied or mistreated in some way or feel they have. And so it creates this mental health that's sort of undercurrent, but it doesn't ever get surfaced. See, if we look at it and we affirm it and say, yeah, let's help you with that. But that's not what our culture traditionally has done here, with early childhood interventions and some of that. It's been a push to try to get that. We can fund a lot of military, but it's really difficult to fund up front. We can fund a lot of prisons, but we don't do a lot up front. So it's always a reaction to rather than a proactive approach.
Just like you're describing with human security. We're really reactionary. We throw walls up and send the troops when things started getting scary instead of taking care of the social structures that are causing those problems.
Do you think we're getting desensitized more and more to these sort of things that happen?
You have to think about there's a couple things. First of all, there's a great report out of Mother Jones magazine on the rise of violence and the relationship between mental health services and gun violence. So that's a good place to start. And they cite several research projects. The other thing is that the size of the population is increasing. So if you think about a certain percentage of the population that is going to have mental health issues, it's just more likelihood that there's more of these incidences are going to happen. It's not all about the structure, but it's also just like the size of the population, that you're going to see more of these kinds of incidences as the population grows.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I get good. Thank you. Thanks for helping inform my
And we always read about Chicago, but there's such a huge
Well,
disparity.
exactly. I mean, that's the.
I mean, it's always in one area of the neighborhood. It's very depressed economically and socially, and it's got racial division, and it just creates all kinds of havoc, you know.
And I think, the conversation of human security really would be important to talk about with people who never felt secure.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of people in our own country that have never ever felt secure in their lives. So we get to privilege ourselves and sort of take the,
Well,
I'm
somebody-
scared about this guy,
Yeah.
but really like, a lot of people live that every single day.
Well, and Amanda's done some research on traumas too. In fact, she's traveling to Kurdistan this month, actually. But the idea that some traumas get inherited too. You know, we don't realize that we're building in new brain structures and inherited trauma that kids don't have to experience firsthand. It could have been 2 generations ago, yet they carry some of those. Some of those.
Yeah, it carries on through the genes, generation by generation. That's like some fascinating new stuff.
Yeah, it truly is. Yeah, I touched on that just a little bit, but yeah, no, I agree. You know, one of the my background in Homeland Security, one of the things that you hear often said is if you make Homeland Security too broad, if you're trying to solve too many things, if you make Homeland Security everything, then it's really nothing at all. In other words, it's so big you can't actually do anything about it. I dispute that notion, that argument, and that's why my sense here as we explore with human security is, no, it really needs to be bigger. You need to open up even further because there are issues like mental health, like displacement, the refugee issues that we've worked with GLINT to understand and talk about. If we don't incorporate these into discussion of what security means, then we're still not getting to what makes individuals feel secure. And by making an individual feel secure, then we talk about, okay, well, how do we make this work for something bigger, our city, our state, our nation? How do we look more broadly at security? So part of my reason for mentioning this idea about if it's everything, it's nothing is, so how do we think about security in such an inclusive way that we do touch those that face threats every day that we just drive right past on I-25, right? Because some of these issues that doesn't, except when they see it in the news, doesn't touch them, nor these. These are large issues too. Climate change clearly is an issue that we're going to have to address now, whether we think about the political implications or the political costs, the financial costs. The notion is this is a challenge that we in our generations are going to need to address. But the other big issues, what else are we missing here? I highlight 2 on here: climate change and global public health. This is a part of the Ebola outbreak from a year and a half ago. So these are issues that while we might have been concerned about in the United States by just like turning on the news, and who here readily admit, I do, that I was nervous about Ebola. Did I think it was going to come to Colorado Springs? But maybe, but I was still worried about it. I think the chances were slim, but nevertheless I was worried about it. But in the global context of how we feel secure and what makes us actually secure, the notion is these pieces touch us. Anybody here concerned about climate change? Right? I mean, so you think about it, it adds weight. It's a weight on your shoulders. It eats away, it chips away at that foundation of what makes us feel secure. Watching the news about Zika or Ebola, it chips away at who we are. And this gets back to the mental health and resiliency piece.
Yeah, one of the things that, kind of recently, I wasn't real aware of it, but with global food and stuff, I think it's interesting when you think about how many corporations control the global food market or the global oil market. And it's very narrow span of corporations. And so it wouldn't be difficult at all for one of them to go down or to squeeze the general public, on prices and different things like that. So you're mostly about food, necessities, not so much oil, but the necessities, I think it's a little scary how many companies control all the wheat and all the meat and all the different things that we consume. Consumer choice.
I think this gets to the point that I mentioned over here earlier. Essentially, it's that hierarchy of needs, right? I mean, when we think about security, the pieces we take for granted here because we're lucky enough to be in an academic environment. We have the luxury to think about these issues. We take some of that for granted just by nature of our plate is so full. Otherwise, I can't afford. I don't need to think about clothing, food, shelter. Right? I can think of it this level or something maybe a higher order of thinking. So when I look at human security and start to get my head around it, the issues are large, and so. How do we start to tackle? Let me turn that question over to you. How do we start to tackle and think about human security? So we know what we're trying to protect now. We know what some of the resources are out there, those that we've relied on in the past to be our protectors. We know what some of the threats are. So how do we start to think about it?
I think that basic human rights is something like globally that we really have to pay attention to. I mean, we're very lucky in the United States for, with kind of being very privileged and having most of our rights attended to, but we also need to stay vigilant, which is why I think we saw like the protests and all this going on recently with the administration. But I think it's really kind of up to us to support the rest of the world in making sure that human rights are secured. There's a lot of countries where, it just doesn't happen. They've never had it, and there's not a good chance that they ever will have it. And so I think, that threatens their human security. I don't know the answer. I have theories, but I think it's an important thing for us to pay attention to. I think that's maybe where it starts. The unsecurity starts with human rights.
Yeah. Okay.
Turn off the TV.
Yeah. There's something and some other electronic devices.
Yeah.
Except for this computer. Any other thoughts? I mean, so what? How do we start to really get our arms around it? I mean, what would make any one of us feel? It doesn't have to be a person. But what makes any one of us feel and be more secure?
The TV.
Yeah.
I mean, seriously.
Yeah.
The
So just the
fear,
notion of the information that we're receiving.
The information that we're receiving makes us even more fearful.
Mm-hmm.
And taking a mental health break. I mean, for the short term and for personal security, that's something to do. But
Yeah. So in the disaster management world, I think, and in mental health, resilience, individual group resilience is a big thing. Right? So how do we foster resilience? Part of that is, you take that mental health break, but you take that, plus you can. Anybody that runs or cycles, any kind of aerobic activity, you push hard, you take a break, and then you can go again, right? And whether it's a day later or an hour later, the notion is you do need that break so that you work the muscle memory, and then you take a break to recover, and then reattack to make stronger, right? So you build that resilience, and that kind of, maybe that's the way to look at it.
You asked what makes me feel more secure. When I'm surrounded by other people who are educated or pursuing education or just have access to it, knowing that other people are thinking critically and questioning makes me feel more secure.
Do those people have to be like-minded? I mean, in the sense
No.
of agree with your opinions? Is that
No, in fact, critical thought would necessitate that we're not all just, replicating the same belief or whatever the case may be.
yeah, education.
Yeah.
Education is a foundation, but more than that, I think your point is really well taken. Is that it's that discussion too, the connection with other humans that seems to be foundational for some of the changes that we're experiencing in our society. So we're one part, right? The United States, our society is one part of this. Something as we look globally, and that's the purpose of GLINT. But the notion of why are we seemingly having more mental health challenges in the United States? Why are we having more Robert Deeres in the United States? At least perception is that we have more of that going on. And why isn't it happening in other places? Or why is it happening slower in Germany than it is here? Why is it happening not at all in some countries? What is foundationally what's different there, rhetorically? So I think that part of it is understanding what is different about us. That gets back to my background in intelligence, right? To understand the situation as it is, right? And look for opportunities to change behaviors, shape behaviors based on information. So I think it's a very good point. It's that discussion, it's that connection piece. Yeah.
Kind of what you mentioned, the media. I think media was completely used to win the last election. Totally manipulated. So using fear and all that kind of stuff to bolster, fear in people and say, I'm going to do something about this and that sort of thing. I think that was used to people's benefit to just for the election, actually. The other thing is, like, I feel like, here I have choices. Went to Uganda, and stuff that I learned over there, a nonprofit over there, people go in, they actually turn out to be a business because they get money from certain places and they have to use it a certain way and that sort of thing. And the people have, they don't have the choice over there, whereas I actually have a choice. So say like they're going to get some help, but they get help however they're going to get that help. They don't have a choice in the kind of help. Here, I have a choice if I want to stay here or if I want to go there and that sort of thing. So I just think about people's choices that they can have and their freedoms that they have versus necessity and what's coming down from the top.
So it's a great point. So does choice build security, or does it build insecurity?
Well, it could do both, but kind of deferring off of that comment, it's, I think of it as in the early days of therapy, the locus of control. If I feel like I have self-control and I have resources and choices, then I feel more secure. When I feel like I don't have self-control, whether it's a panic attack or depression or relational, breakup, whatever, when I can't control that, then it's really difficult. So then I need my resources. And if I have good social resources, not only the basics, but beyond that, extended family, friends, people that are supportive and information. So it's all part of that. I think when I lump those two things together, that would pretty much encompass what I think I might need is a sense of locus of control. And when I don't have that, then I've got resources, choices, things I can go to get to, supplement that and bolster me.
So the extension of that is if I personally don't have control, as long as I trust those that I've ceded control to or that assume control, that's okay as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you're more likely, if you don't have like basic human rights and choices, to do some of these things. And terrorism, I believe, is one. I mean, if we don't feel like we have any locus of control, it may be interesting to sit down with an ISIS guy and just talk to him, like, how did you end up here? Or how did, what led to that? Even maybe if you've done that, maybe people who've done that.
Or you can also use the word empowerment too, because that bullies that.
Or loss of power.
Yeah, they kind of they probably feel disempowered. Other people who are.
I'd be willing to bet they probably don't feel like they had a lot of control over their lives.
Or that they can trust how they've given over control, like the police officers in central Chicago. People just feel as though they gave their trust, or maybe they never did because there's always control over that population. But that creates, I like that locus of control. That's cool.
It's an interesting point, isn't it? Because again, one of the things that struck me when you mentioned that, and as I replayed the words back to you, was, so I trust my leadership. I trust, this is Germany in 1933, right? I trust my leadership. And so how do we, there are some elements there clearly that we work through. And again, I mean no intention to draw parallels to the current situation, but rather I think that is an extreme where, it's my government and I'm busy doing what I'm doing and I trust, trust them. And so as you seek control and you're comfortable with that, I feel safe, I feel secure because I've given trust to the Chicago PD, implicit trust, if not explicit, until they break it, right? So that's when it gets a little wobbly, I would think. And again, I'm out of my league here in discussing this, but rather, I think these categories are something important because how do we think about what makes me secure, right? I mean, generally, I just go about my life thinking, okay, I have some control, there's some things I know I can't, and so I'm feeling pretty good about that until something gets out of balance, right? There's something that changes, and that's the part that I'm trying to understand as I further explore what human security means. And so I appreciate your comments there, Pam.
So
So I wonder what the relationship is between tolerance, somebody or some culture's level of tolerance for disruption to their security, and resilience. Is there a relationship there?
And it's not something I've come across in the literature on resilience, but it's a good one, and I'd like to explore that further. So, Pam, can you talk a little bit more about what you're thinking there, and I'll try to.
I guess I wonder if for people or groups of people who don't have the same kind of security that perhaps we do, maybe it's around food or just everything is a little more tenuous in their lives. Are those people more or less resilient than those of us who have?
There's a great book by an anthropologist, I cannot think of her name right now, but if you were to look up anthropologist resilience, she has done some fascinating work on mental health issues in countries where there's no stability, right? Or there's stability in dictatorship or authoritarianism. And there's a very high level of resilience and sort of her approach is on post-traumatic stress disorder. And like there's so many different ways of coping with it than the way that we do. And in some ways it's actually a critique of our mental health institutions, because we have led to more victimization mentality rather than like I'm empowered to take control over my small space. So I might think of it by the end,
But that goes back to the control piece, right?
I think my thought is we start to look at human security when we get to these foundational issues. Right? And that's where we start to make a difference, because we can shape how we feel about our own security. Again, that's broadly the notion is how you shape your own security can lead to how you understand how to shape your neighborhood, your community, etc. Right? How you expand that out. It's solving world hunger is a problem. Feeding a family is less so, right? But you can solve world hunger by feeding families and take that out. So notionally, that's the concept that I'm trying to understand and get to with human security.
I'm just reiterating the different way what people have already said. I feel, and this is about control, I feel secure when I'm by myself at my house versus when I go out into the world. I also feel secure, I guess, through experience, and when I gain capacity to be able to, and abilities to be able to do things and to contribute in the world. I feel secure when I'm developing in a certain way too.
Thanks for leading into that point. And so resilience studies will suggest that we develop more individual resilience when we feel that we're contributing outside, right? So if there's Waldo Canyon, if there's an event in our neighborhood, if I'm able to help someone else, that increases my ability to maintain some semblance of control and to provide some individual resilience. Does that make sense? Is that a potential way to start to think about human security as well? As just as Matt suggested, is that we can be individuals and we can develop our own security, but we're more secure when we link with other humans and make contributions there. And that doesn't mean we have to be lifesavers. It just could be, handing out a blanket. It could be, right, any number of things. One of the analogies I gave early on when I was working strictly Homeland Security was if you're involved in an office shooting event, an active shooter event, try to think of your security in terms of not being a victim, not requiring resources from the emergency services. Doesn't mean you go out and stop the shooter, but rather don't be someone that requires services that could otherwise go to somebody that needs them. So as a starting point is to be, and that's where I started to formulate the idea that mental health was a key component to any aspect of security. So I'm glad that you both are here at least to talk and keep me sane and rational. Any other questions or thoughts on that? I just have a few visuals left here. It's not critical by any stretch. When we don't have security, we have some other things, right? So insecurity, So these may be some familiar scenes, right? So some war-torn scenes in Syria, same, right? I mean, this is insecurity at an international level. We look at the refugees and the consequences and how we then breed another generation of insecurity potentially. And then issues that, again, I think closer to home, although this next image is not, is the notion of how we think about our interactions when we leave the house. We may not be comfortable with someone that's different from us, but how do we think about it so that it's not a threat, right? So the notion of, we're confronted with this every day in the news now, right? It started a year plus ago, really with talking, the genesis of the campaign about a Muslim ban, the conversations around that. Emily and I have shared conversations and community conversations around this. The notion of your security is dependent on somebody else's insecurity strikes me as foundationally incorrect. It doesn't help my security. But I'm open to discussion on that, right? The notion of how do we think about our own security in relation to those around us? What builds of security? And so again, these are just some legacy slides, and of course, then we think about it in terms of, well, Matt still gets out of his house, right? But the analogy is here: do we get out of our house? I mean, this is the wall in Israel, right? But do we get out of our house, or do we build a wall? Do we stay inside? Is that zone of control, that span of control, is that really what drives it? Or how else can we think about it? How better said, how might we expand our thinking of our span of control?
Steve, do your last slide and then I'll ask, I guess.
No, it's okay.
Well, I'm just wondering then why is that working? Why is that rhetoric working?
I think it's good. It's a good question.
So afraid. It's just like, I think that he speaks to a lot of fears, like irrational fears of people. I'm just talking about Trump.
But I think that's exactly, that's why I led this off with September 11th.
We've been preaching this other concept of resilience and connectivity and intercultural understanding for just decades of education and discussion, and yet we're here now.
So let me throw this out, and please, I appreciate your feedback on it, because this is, I'm trying to understand better what human security means to us. And that is that an event like September 11th, but you pick another, but September 11th was big enough that it allowed a different message to come through. That years of education, years of thinking, talking about this, progress towards, in the context you have, that it's foundational to the act of terror. Terror and terrorism, notionally the definition is an act of violence or a threat of an act of violence on civilian populations to change behaviors, right? To create fear, to change behavior. So the notion is the uncertainty around it, that anybody could be bad at any time, is what drives the challenges and the success of the rhetoric here, I think. And part of that is reinforced, of course, by San Bernardino. Hey, we're just having coffee together, and then go out to the car and come back with semi-automatic weapons and kill 13 of us. Or Orlando, or Robert Deere, right? Or Sandy Hook, right? So Paris or Brussels. I mean, I think the notion of it could happen anywhere, anytime is now foundational to our way of thinking, and that it's a razor's edge. So I think my point, Emily, is it's a razor's edge that I can be rational and forgiving and open now, but after the next San Bernardino, I'm everywhere, right? There are threats everywhere. Right? I'm worried about my security, my family. I want to make sure, they're older now. My girls can get to school and be safe at school, but now we're having, school shoot. So everywhere is a threat. I think that's the part we have to beat back with something that is more foundational than an armed police force or an armed, right? Because you can't guard everything all the time. That is foundational to the acts of terror. Is that we can get you when where you don't expect it. So that strikes me again as where we control, and that control piece may be the resilience aspect. So that bad things are going to happen. Sorry, bad things are going to happen. And so they're probably going to happen to me. It could be a car accident. It could be mugged. It could be the house could be burgled. Whatever. It could be much worse. So we know bad things are going to happen. The trick is how do we prepare for it to some degree, the best we can, and then how do we recover when it does happen. I think that's back to my point here. The mental health side is essential here. And it's something we're not well prepared for. So this is Steve. I generally don't, these are opinions at this point now, and that is, I think what's different in the United States and what we've come to is we've relied on the mental health profession to be, or state, local, federal agencies to be the cavalry that will ride in to save the day. Other countries, notionally, poor, rich, have foundational structures that are not necessarily government-based, that are not necessarily, I will buy or get a service. So, I'm speaking purely anecdotally here, but if you look at a Western European country, I've spent quite a bit of time in Western Europe, in many countries, and there's a family structure that's disintegrated in Western Europe, but nevertheless, it's still a much stronger connection. So I have extended family, Latin America, where I do a lot of work now, extended families that my therapist is my grandmother. I go and she's living with us. I sit down and talk to her versus I need to go find a service, and by the way, how am I going to pay for that? And I only have 8 sessions, and right, or I'm going to, I'm going to confess my sins to, to the church. I'm going to go talk to the priest, or I'm going to go. There's a religious connection that I can go to. I can go to the imam or the rabbi or wherever I'm going to go. That is not here. That's not part of our culture. We're individuals. I'm the West. If I need to, okay, I'll buy a handgun. That's not bad, right? I go buy a handgun and I'll take care of myself. I'm independent. My family's independent. We don't need anybody. I think there's some element of that contributes to why we're, as we continue to break down a societal structure, as we further disperse through economics, through a variety of reasons, I think that's more of a challenge for us. Okay? That's not the purpose of human security is international, right? So I'm looking at human security in Uganda and Germany as well as the United States, but here personally, anecdotally, these are things that I feel like I'm seeing here that's different. So, but I mean, this is more your space than mine, so I'm way out on a limb on that.
I just want to circle back to what you said about acceptance. I think that's really interesting that to sort of add that in as a layer of security is to sort of accept, and that goes back to what you were saying, that there is going to be some level of uncertainty, and that you actually gain more of a controlled feeling if you yourself say, I'm going to accept the fact that some of these things are unknown, and just build it into your mental framework, and it almost gives you more control to say, I'm accepting the fact that a lot of this is outside of my control. Some of it that I need to be thinking about, or should I be trusting the people ahead that I'm, giving control to, or whatever the case. But yeah, I thought that was really interesting, just to circle back to that piece on acceptance and secure in that notion of the unknown.
Thanks. Well, that pretty much wraps up. I've got a slide here, just personalities, as we start to think about how we think about it. We've seen voices out both in the wilderness and the mainstream talking about how they think about security. So, around the room, you're familiar, because these aren't great. Vlad and Taylor, so President Putin, President of Mexico, Premier of Canada, President Trump. Anybody know who she is?
Is that me?
This is perhaps the next President of France.
France, that's
Right, Marine Le Pen. UN Secretary General, Premier of China. Vote. Right? People are talking about this, talking about security in different contexts. A lot of noise out there is my intent here. But a lot of good things as well. A lot of people talking about how we should feel about our security. Now the question is how we blend these messages to get something that makes sense for us. So, thanks for the conversation. That was what I was hoping for as well, and I hope this answered the mail with